She woke up before sunrise, as she always did, because the house never felt safe after dark. The roof leaked when it rained, and the thin walls carried every sound from outside. Even in silence, she could feel the weight of the place pressing on her chest. She lay still for a moment, listening to her own breath, reminding herself that she was still here, still alive, still able to think. She had not always lived like this. There was a time when mornings smelled of warm tea and bread, when voices spoke gently and laughter was allowed to exist without fear. The time felt far away now, like a story told by someone else. After losing her parents, she had been passed from one place to another, till she ended up in this house with people who barely looked at her as a person. To them, she was a burden that needed to be managed, fed just enough, and kept quiet. She rose slowly and folded the thin blanket with care. Being careful had become her habit. Careful steps, careful words, careful silence. Any mistake could bring anger, and anger in this house was loud and painful. She washed her face at the small tap outside, the cold water shocking her awake. As she looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror, she searched for something familiar. The girl looking back at her seemed older than her years, but her eyes still held something alive. The day began like many others, with chores that never ended. Sweeping the floor, washing dishes, carrying water, running small errands in the neighborhood. People saw her every day, yet few really noticed her. She blended into the background, like dust in the air. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, and some with eyes that made her uncomfortable. She had learned to keep her head down and move quickly. That afternoon, she overheard a conversation that made her hands freeze. She was standing behind a half-open door, waiting to be called. Inside the room, voices spoke in low tones, but not low enough. They talked about money, about debts that had grown too heavy. Then one voice said something that made her heart pound. They mentioned her, not as a child, not as a girl, but as a solution. She pressed her fingers against the wall to steady herself. The words felt unreal, like they could not possibly be about her, but they were clear. They talked about her age, her quiet nature, her ability to obey. They talked about how someone would be willing to pay. Then came the number. $500. The amount was spoken casually, as if it were a fair price for an old appliance or a piece of land. Her mind raced. $500 was more money than she had ever held in her hands, yet hearing it tied to her life made her feel small and empty. She wanted to scream, to burst into the room and tell them she was not an object, but fear locked her in place. She knew what happened to people who spoke out without power. She knew silence had kept her alive so far. When the voices stopped, she moved away quietly. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk normally. She went back to her chores as if nothing had happened. Inside, her thoughts were loud and wild. Was this really happening? Had her life been reduced to a price written in someone else's mind? That evening, she sat alone near the doorway, watching the sky turn orange and then dark. She remembered her parents' voices, not clearly, but enough to feel their presence. They had taught her that her life had value beyond money, beyond fear. Those memories felt like a small flame inside her chest, fragile but warm. As night fell, visitors arrived. She was told to clean and serve tea. Her hands trembled as she poured cups, aware that eyes were studying her. Some of the men spoke politely, others barely acknowledged her. One of them asked questions about her age and health, pretending it was casual conversation. She answered softly, choosing her words carefully. Every answer felt like another step closer to something she did not want. She noticed how her guardian smiled more than usual. The tone of the room felt different. There was an agreement forming in the air, unspoken but heavy. She understood then that this was not just talk. Plans were being made, and she was at the center of them. That night, sleep refused to come. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks. Fear wrapped around her like a tightrope, but beneath it, something else began to grow. Anger. Not loud anger, but a quiet one. The kind that sharpens the mind. She realized that crying would not save her. Begging would not change anything. If she wanted to survive, she would need to think. She started paying closer attention to everything. Who came and went, who spoke kindly, who avoided eye contact. She listened more than she spoke, storing details in her memory. Every name she overheard, every place mentioned, every promise hinted at. She knew she had little power, but knowledge felt like a small shield. The next day, she was told to dress more neatly than usual. The clothes were still simple, but the message was clear. She felt like she was being prepared, not for life, but for display. Her stomach twisted, yet she held her head steady. She reminded herself that as long as she could think, she still had control over something. When she stepped outside, the world looked the same, but she felt different. She was no longer just surviving each day. She was watching, learning, waiting. She did not know exactly how or when, but deep inside, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would not let her story end with a price tag as the sun dipped low again. She stood at the edge of the yard, feeling the evening breeze on her face. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her completely. Courage, she realized, did not arrive loudly. It came softly, like a thought you'd choose to believe in. And that thought stayed with her as darkness fell, preparing her for the days ahead. Morning came with heavy clouds. The air felt thick, as if the day itself was holding its breath. She woke up with her heart already racing. The fear from the night before had not faded. Instead, it had settled deep inside her, quiet and constant. She sat up slowly, careful not to make noise, and looked around the small room. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt normal anymore. She went through her routine as usual, washing, cleaning, preparing food. Her hands moved on their own, trained by years of habit, while her mind stayed alert. Every sound made her pause. Every voice made her listen harder. She was no longer just living in the house. She was studying it. People spoke more openly now, thinking she did not understand. They discussed timing, travel, and arrangements as if she were not standing a few steps away. She kept her face calm and her eyes lowered, but inside her thoughts were sharp. She noticed how often money was mentioned, how debt had become the excuse for everything cruel. She understood then that in their minds, they had already justified what they were planning to do later that day. She was sent to buy groceries from the nearby shops. Normally, this small task felt like freedom. Today it felt different. As she walked through the narrow streets, she paid attention to the people around her. Families laughed. Children ran freely. Life continued, unaware of the storm growing inside her. She wondered how many others walked these same roads, carrying secrets like hers. At one shop, an older woman looked at her for a long moment before handing her the items. The woman's eyes softened, as if she sensed something was wrong. For a brief second, the girl wanted to speak. The words rose in her throat, heavy and urgent, but fear pushed them back down. She thanked the woman quietly and left, feeling both relieved and ashamed. When she returned home, she heard raised voices. Someone was angry about the amount of money. Another argued that it was fair. Her name came up again, spoken without care. She stood outside the room, breathing slowly, forcing herself not to react. She realized then that waiting for someone to rescue her was dangerous. If help came, it would have to be because she found a way to bring it closer. That night, she sat near the window, watching the street below. A dim light flickered on and off, casting long shadows. She thought about the risks. Running away without a plan could leave her trapped somewhere worse. Staying silent would lead her exactly where they wanted her to go. Neither choice felt safe. Yet doing nothing felt like the worst option of all. She remembered something her parent once said during a difficult time. When everything feels dark, look for the smallest opening. That thought stayed with her. She began searching for those openings, no matter how small they seemed. Over the next few days, she paid close attention to one particular visitor. This person spoke less harshly than the others, and sometimes avoided certain conversations. The girl noticed small things. A pause before agreeing. A look away when money was discussed. These details gave her a fragile sense of hope. She did not trust easily, but she knew she had to take careful risks. One afternoon, she was asked to bring tea to the sitting area. As she placed the cups down, Her hand shook slightly. She took a breath and spoke softly, choosing her words with care. She said she was grateful for being allowed to stay in the house and wanted to work honestly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held something deeper. A quiet plea hidden beneath polite words. The room fell silent for a moment. No one responded directly, but she felt a shift. Later, she noticed that same visitor watching her with a thoughtful expression. It was not kindness she saw, but uncertainty. And uncertainty, she knew, could be powerful. That evening, she began writing things down in her mind. Dates, times, places. She memorized conversations as best as she could. She replayed them again and again until they felt solid. She understood that memory was the only place where no one could take things away from her. Her fear did not disappear. Some nights it wrapped around her so tightly she struggled to breathe. She cried quietly into her pillow, careful not to let anyone hear. But even in those moments, she reminded herself that fear did not mean weakness. It meant she cared enough to survive. The next day brought another instruction. She was told to be ready soon, that changes were coming. The tone used was final, as if the decision had already been made. Her chest tightened, but she nodded without argument. Inside, her resolve grew stronger. Time was running out. She found small ways to leave signs of herself behind. A short conversation here. A careful question there. She spoke to a neighbor while sweeping outside, mentioning how uncertain her future felt. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. She hoped someone would hear what she could not say openly. One evening, she stood alone washing dishes. She caught her reflection in the water. She looked tired, scared, but still standing. That sight gave her strength. She understood then that courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to move forward despite it. As days passed, tension filled the house. Preparations became more obvious. The girl stayed quiet, but her mind worked constantly. She trusted her instincts more now. She knew who to avoid and who to observe. She learned when to speak and when silence was safer. On the final night of that week, she sat outside under the open sky. Stars flickered faintly above. She whispered a promise to herself, barely louder than the wind. No matter what happened next, she would not give up her voice. Even if it had to be used in silence, fear still walked beside her, but it no longer controlled her steps. Something stronger had taken its place. Determination. And with that determination, she prepared herself for whatever the next day would bring, knowing that her courage, quiet as it was, had already begun to change her fate. The day she feared finally arrived, not with noise or drama, but with quiet urgency. She woke before anyone else, her body tense, her mind already racing. The house felt different that morning. There was a sense of movement, of plans being pushed forward. She could feel it in the way footsteps hurried, and voices stayed low, but serious. She washed her face slowly, letting the cold water steady her nerves. As she looked at herself, she reminded herself of everything she had noticed over the past days. Every word overheard. Every look exchanged. Every moment she had stored in her memory. She knew fear would try to take over. She also knew she'd come too far to let it win now. She was told to stay inside and be ready. Those words sounded simple, but they carried weight. She nodded and did as asked, sitting quietly in her small corner. From there, she could hear parts of conversations drifting through the house. Someone mentioned travel later that evening. Another spoke about meeting a buyer halfway. Each sentence felt like a ticking clock. Instead of freezing, she focused. She replayed everything she knew, searching for a weak point. She thought about the visitor who showed hesitation, the neighbor who listened carefully, the shopkeeper who looked at her with concern. She realized that not everyone around her agreed with what was happening. Some were unsure. Some were uncomfortable, and those feelings could be used later in the day. She was asked to help prepare food. The kitchen became her space to think. As she worked, she spoke softly to herself, keeping her voice calm. She reminded herself to breathe, to move naturally, to avoid drawing suspicion. Every action felt important now. At one point, she was sent outside to throw away scraps. That short walk felt like a chance. She noticed the neighbor standing nearby, sweeping the front of their home. The girl hesitated only for a second before speaking. She did not explain everything. She did not accuse anyone. She simply said she was afraid of being sent away and did not know where she would end up. The neighbor paused and looked at her carefully. No promises were made. No dramatic words were spoken. But the look in the neighbor's eyes changed. The girl thanked them and returned inside, her heart pounding. She did not know if that small moment would matter, but it was something. As evening approached, tension filled the house. People arrived one by one. Their voices were hushed, their expressions serious. She was asked to sit quietly and wait. She kept her eyes down, but she listened closely. Plans were being finalized. Times were being set. Then something unexpected happened. The hesitant visitor arrived again earlier than planned. Their presence shifted the mood slightly. Questions were asked that had not been asked before. Clarifications were demanded. The girl noticed the irritation this caused. She also noticed the cracks forming in the confidence of those in charge. She was called into the room briefly. As she stood there, she felt dozens of eyes on her. Instead of shrinking, she stood straight. She answered questions clearly and calmly. Her voice did not shake. She spoke with respect, but also with quiet strength. It was a small change, but it was enough to be noticed. After she was sent away, voices rose. Arguments followed. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough to know that doubt was spreading. The plan was no longer as smooth as they wanted it to be. That night, she barely ate. Her stomach was tight with worry. She sat alone, thinking about what might come next. She knew this was the most dangerous part. When plans fall apart, people often act without care. She stayed alert, ready for anything. As darkness settled, she heard footsteps outside. Someone was speaking urgently, their voice low but firm. Moments later, there was a knock at the door that felt heavier than any before. The room went silent. She stayed where she was, her heart beating loudly in her ears. Voices argued at the entrance. Words like questions, concerns, and reports floated through the air. She realized then that something had reached beyond the house. Someone had spoken. Someone had acted. The situation did not end that night, but it changed. The people who once spoke with certainty now sounded defensive. The confident tone was gone. She could feel control slipping from their hands. Later, she was told to return to her room and wait. No instructions. No explanations. Just wait. She did so, sitting on her bed, listening to the night sounds. Fear was still there, but hope had joined it now. A cautious hope, fragile but real. She thought about courage again. Not the loud kind people talk about in stories, but the quiet kind that grows in silence. The kind that makes you speak one careful sentence, take one small risk, trust one instinct. As the night stretched on, she realized that no matter what happened next, she had already changed something. She had refused to disappear quietly. She had made herself seen without shouting. She had turned fear into action. When sleep finally came, it was light and restless. But for the first time in many nights, it carried something new. The sense that her life was no longer moving in only one direction. The path ahead was still unclear, but it was no longer closed. Morning would bring consequences. She knew that, but it would also bring answers. As she drifted into uneasy rest, one thought stayed with her, steady and strong. She was no longer just waiting to be chosen. She was choosing to fight for herself. The next morning was heavy with expectation. She woke to the quiet sounds of the house, footsteps moving with purpose, voices careful but urgent. She did not speak. She did not move more than necessary. Instead, she listened, taking in every detail she could. Each sound, each word, each pause felt important. She had learned by now that information was power. Her chores were given as usual. But today, everything felt like part of a larger plan she could not fully see. She washed dishes and swept floors with practiced hands, all the while counting steps, remembering conversations, noting behaviors. She knew that what she did not say was just as important as what she observed. She was invisible, yet fully present. a paradox that kept her alive and alert. By mid-morning, several men arrived at the house. Their faces were unfamiliar, serious, and businesslike. They spoke quietly with their guardians, pointing at papers and counting money. The girl watched from the doorway, pretending to gather dishes, while secretly taking in the details. She memorized names, gestures, numbers, and tone. Every observation mattered. She felt her heart hammer, but she did not allow fear to overwhelm her. Her guardian called her over. She approached slowly, keeping her face neutral. She was instructed to wait in a corner while the visitors inspected the house. She obeyed, her mind racing. She realized this was the moment everything could go either way. If she reacted too quickly, spoke out, or made a wrong move, the plan could proceed as intended. If she stayed calm, alert, and clever, the chances of change grew. Minutes passed like hours. Then, an unexpected voice called her name. One of the visitors, someone who had seemed hesitant in prior days, motioned her closer. The girl stepped forward cautiously. The man spoke in a low, careful tone. He asked her questions about her life, about her home, about what she wanted. She answered truthfully, calmly, carefully. No hesitation, no fear, no apology. She spoke with dignity, even when her words were simple. There was power in her voice, even in quietness. After she stepped back, she noticed a subtle shift. The visitors no longer moved with the same certainty. The confident expressions of her guardians began to falter. She could sense doubt creeping in. It was a delicate change, almost imperceptible, but it was there. While the adults argued quietly, she made another careful move. She left the room for a moment carrying a small envelope she had found earlier, filled with documents and evidence of conversations she had memorized. She slipped it into a bag that belonged to the hesitant visitor without anyone noticing. This act was silent, invisible, but deliberate. It was a way to put proof into the hands of someone who might help her. Later, when the discussion resumed, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Her guardians seemed anxious, repeating explanations, justifying choices, their confidence cracking under careful scrutiny. The hesitant visitor asked pointed questions now, referencing small details and inconsistencies. The girl could not see all that was said, but the tension was clear. She realized that her small, careful acts had begun to turn the tables. Throughout the day, she remained alert, ready for anything. She delivered food, carried messages, and listened at doorways. Every step she took was measured. Every word she spoke was neutral, polite, unassuming. Yet behind the calm exterior, she was constantly observing, analyzing, and calculating. She had learned that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered quietly, and sometimes it acted Sibyl. By evening, the arguments had escalated. Voices raised in private corners. Threats were exchanged, warnings given. The girl sat quietly in her corner, heart pounding, knowing that the moment she had prepared for was coming. The visitors were no longer certain. The plans her guardians had made with such care were unraveling, little by little. Suddenly, the hesitant visitor motioned for her again. This time, the man spoke with urgency and seriousness. He informed her that steps were being taken to protect her and ensure she would not be harmed. The girl's mind raced. She felt relief, disbelief, and cautious hope all at once. It was not yet over, she knew, but change was possible. For the first time, she felt that she had an ally. When the adults left to finalize arrangements, she sat quietly thinking about how far she had come. Fear had accompanied her every step, but so had determination. Her observations, her careful words, her quiet courage, they had started to reshape events. The knowledge that she could influence the outcome, even in small ways, was empowering. She realized she was no longer just a passive participant. She was acting, shaping her own story. That night, she barely slept. She lay awake, thinking about the next steps. She knew that while immediate danger was reduced, the future was still uncertain. She had to remain alert, continue observing, and be ready to act. Her courage, born from fear, had grown stronger. It was no longer only about survival. It was about taking control, even in the smallest ways. As darkness enveloped the house, she whispered quietly to herself. She had turned fear into action. She had made small choices that mattered. And though the full outcome was still unknown, she knew one truth clearly. She was no longer powerless. The quiet strength she had cultivated in the shadows had begun to show, changing the course of events in ways she could only hope would last. Morning arrived with a calm she had not felt in a long time, though her senses remained alert. The house was quieter than usual, the adults moving with tension, speaking in low tones. She noticed every step, every glance, every half-spoken word. The events of the previous day had changed things. The visitors had left clear signs that someone outside was watching, and now, the adult's confidence was replaced with caution. She went about her morning chores with steady hands. But her mind was active, calculating, observing. She paid close attention to the people she had identified as potential allies. The neighbor who had offered a kind glance, the visitor who had shown hesitation. Anyone who could help her stay safe and finally free. She knew that each small interaction could tip the balance further in her favor. By late morning, the atmosphere shifted. Someone at the front door was speaking to the adults in a firm voice. She could hear parts of the conversation and caught enough to understand that authorities had been alerted, that steps were being taken to prevent the sale she had overheard. Her heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The culmination of the courage she had quietly nurtured. She stayed calm outwardly, doing what she was asked. She served tea, cleaned, and obeyed instructions. Inside, she felt the rush of hope mixed with the lingering fear that had accompanied her every step. She reminded herself to stay quiet, careful, and precise. Any misstep now could still undo everything. Then the door opened, and the hesitant visitor returned, followed by serious-looking officials. The adults in the house froze, and the girl instinctively stepped back, staying calm but alert. The officials asked questions, checked documents, and moved with authority. The girl watched carefully, noting reactions. Understanding that the power dynamics had shifted completely, her guardians tried to speak, to explain, to minimize, but the officials were firm. They asked questions she had silently prepared answers for in her mind, about the girl's living conditions, her treatment, and her safety. She answered when asked, voice steady, eyes clear. She did not plead. She did not beg. She spoke with simple honesty, and it carried weight. The adult's confidence crumbled. Their excuses faltered under scrutiny. The girl saw the change, saw the power slipping from those who had tried to treat her as property. Her courage, her preparation, and her careful observation had contributed to this moment. She felt a quiet strength, knowing that even small acts of bravery could shift the course of events. Once the situation was under control, the officials spoke to her gently, asking how she felt, what she wanted, and what she needed. For the first time in weeks, she realized that someone truly cared about her wishes. She asked for safety, for a place where she could live without fear, and for the chance to continue her education. Each request was simple, human, and reasonable. Yet it was powerful because it came from her own voice. The adults were warned and ordered to leave or face consequences. The house felt lighter, the tension dissipating. And the girl understood that the nightmare she had been trapped in was ending. Relief, cautious but real, flowed through her. She had survived not by luck but by courage, by patience, and by using the quiet power she had cultivated. As she was escorted out of the house by authorities, she took a moment to look back. The rooms that had once felt oppressive now felt like a space she had conquered. Not by force, but by observation, patience, and careful action. She had turned fear into a tool, used courage as a shield, found allies in unexpected places. The journey after that was gradual, but steady. She was taken to a safe place, given food, warmth, and care. She was allowed to rest and recover, and slowly, the weight of weeks and months lifted from her shoulders. She began to speak to others about her experience, sharing her story not to blame, but to warn and to inspire. She also returned in small ways to the world she had observed while trapped. She visited the markets, walked the streets, and noticed the little things that made life worth living. Each step reminded her that courage could take many forms: speaking up, staying silent when necessary, observing, planning, and acting when the moment arrived. Her story spread quietly at first, then more broadly. People learned of the girl who had been marked for sale at $500, but had refused to let fear rule her. Her voice, once suppressed, became a source of hope for others who had felt powerless. She met others who had faced similar dangers and helped them find their own courage, guiding them as she had been guided in small, subtle ways. Over time, her life took on new meaning. Education, friendships, and a sense of agency replaced the fear and uncertainty that had once dominated her days. She became a symbol of quiet strength, proving that courage, even in the most vulnerable, could turn the darkest situations into stories of hope and survival. Reflecting on her journey, she understood one truth deeply: no one can truly price another human being. Life cannot be bought or sold when the spirit within refuses to be broken. She had been marked at $500, but she had reclaimed her value in ways no amount of money could ever measure. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, but inspired others to find their own courage in the shadows of fear. The days after her rescue felt like waking from a long, heavy dream. She moved carefully in her new surroundings, each room a reminder that life could be gentle, that people could be kind, that fear could be replaced with safety. The sun felt warmer, the air cleaner, and even small sounds, a bird singing. Footsteps on gravel brought a strange, calming sense of normalcy she'd almost forgotten. Her first days were quiet. She spent time observing, listening, and learning. There were people around who cared, who spoke gently, and who encouraged her to share her story if she wanted to. At first, she remained silent, unsure how to put months of fear, tension, and courage into words. But slowly, the memories began to find their place, not as burdens, but as lessons and reminders of her own strength. She was introduced to other children who had faced hardships. Some were shy, some openly fearful, some quiet, like she had been. She realized that she could help them, not by telling them what to do, but by simply showing that survival and courage were possible. She learned their stories, shared her small victories, and listened without judgment. In that simple exchange, she found a new purpose. Education became her new path. She had missed years of learning, but she approached it with a hunger and determination that amazed those around her. Every letter she wrote, every lesson she learned, felt like reclaiming a piece of her life that had been threatened. She worked quietly but intensely, determined to build a future where she would never feel powerless again. The authorities continued to monitor her case to ensure her safety, and she slowly built trust with those who had helped her. Each interaction reinforced her understanding that courage and careful action had the power to bring about real change. She remembered every risk she had taken in silence, every observation she had made, every careful word she had spoken, and realized that those small acts had paved the way for her freedom. Weeks turned into months, and the house where she had been trapped was no longer in her mind as a place of fear. Instead, it became a reminder of how far she had come. She could walk past it without trembling. She could speak of it without tears. Her strength had been forged quietly in those dark rooms. It now carried her forward. One afternoon, she visited the market with a small group of friends from her new safe environment. The colors, sounds, and smells felt vibrant, alive, and different from the days when every corner carried a threat. She laughed at a joke someone made, a sound that surprised her by how freely it left her throat. She noticed other girls and boys in the crowd, observing them with empathy and recognition. She knew that many like her carried hidden battles. As she walked, she thought about the idea of courage. She realized that it did not only belong to those who shouted or acted boldly in public. Courage could also be quiet. It could be the patience to wait for the right moment, the thoughtfulness to act carefully, the strength to observe, plan, and take small steps. Her courage had saved her life, and it now helped her inspire others without saying a word. Her voice, once silenced, became a tool. She started speaking at small gatherings, quietly at first, telling her story not for attention, but to guide and protect. People listened with rapt attention, feeling the weight of her experience and the calm authority in her words. She encouraged others to pay attention to the details around them, to trust their instincts, to hold on to hope even in impossible situations. Through this work, she met mentors and allies who showed her new opportunities. She learned about legal rights, safety measures, and ways to protect vulnerable people. She understood that her story was not just personal, it was part of a larger struggle for justice and compassion. She embraced this responsibility, quietly determined to make her experiences meaningful for more than just herself. Evenings were her time for reflection. She would sit by a window or walk along quiet streets, thinking of the house she had escaped, the people she had feared, and the allies she had found. She realized that fear had been a teacher as much as it had been a jailer. Every careful choice, every silent observation, every whispered thought had contributed to her survival, and now those lessons could help others. Her life slowly became balanced between recovery, education, and helping others. She learned to cook, to manage small tasks, and to engage with the community around her. Each small success felt profound. She celebrated them quietly. But they mattered deeply because they were earned and because they symbolized freedom. Months passed, and she found herself speaking to larger groups, advocating for children in situations like hers. Her story inspired action, encouraged vigilance, and reminded people that courage and patience were powerful forces. The girl who had been marked for sale for $500 was no longer silent, no longer powerless. She had transformed fear into purpose and had created a life built on dignity, resilience, and hope. At night before sleep, she sometimes thought back to her darkest days. She remembered fear, isolation, and the constant weight of uncertainty. But she also remembered the quiet strength she had discovered in herself, the careful steps she had taken, and the allies who had helped. And she smiled softly, knowing that she had not only survived, but had found a way to help others do the same. Her journey was far from over, but it was hers. Every day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to act with courage, wisdom, and compassion. And in that, she found the truest kind of freedom, the freedom to live fully, to speak, to learn, and to inspire, all because she refused to be reduced to a price and chose to take her life back, step by careful step. Months had passed since she had been taken to safety. Yet each day still carried lessons and challenges she had to face. Life had changed dramatically, but her past lingered in small way shadows in the corners of her mind. Moments of hesitation when she trusted too quickly, and sudden memories of fear that had once been constant. She knew that recovery was not a straight path, and she accepted that it would take time to fully feel free. She began to take small trips outside the safe house, guided by the mentors who had taken an interest in her well-being. At first, each step beyond familiar walls was a test of courage. The streets seemed crowded and overwhelming, but she reminded herself of the careful patience that had carried her through the darkest days. She focused on breathing, on observing, and on staying present in every moment. During these walks, she noticed children playing in alleys, vendors calling out their goods, and families going about their daily lives. For the first time, she saw herself not just as a survivor, but as part of the wider world. She realized that the world was not entirely dangerous. It was filled with small moments of joy, care, an ordinary life that she had almost forgotten. Her mentors encouraged her to speak about her experience in safe and structured environments. She began sharing her story with groups of children and adults who wanted to understand how to prevent exploitation and support those at risk. Each retelling brought new reflections. She found that, by speaking calmly, with honesty, and without dramatizing fear, she could make people listen and take action. Her voice had become a tool, strong in its simplicity and sincerity. School became her anchor. She approached her studies with determination, filling in the gaps of lost years with intense focus. Every letter she wrote, every lesson she completed, felt like reclaiming pieces of herself that had been hidden or stolen. The sense of achievement was profound. It was no longer just about knowledge, but about proving to herself that she had control over her own future. Outside the classroom, she also began to explore new skills. She learned to cook, to sew, and to create small crafts that she could share with her community. Each skill reinforced her independence and reminded her that she was capable of shaping her life in meaningful ways. The simple act of creating, of producing something with her hands, gave her confidence that fear had once suppressed. Over time, she became a mentor herself. Children who had experienced hardship sought her guidance. She did not impose herself, but she listened, observed, and offered gentle advice. She taught them the importance of awareness, careful action, and inner courage. Her experience gave her insight that adults could not always provide. Through these small acts, she found that her suffering had transformed into a source of help and hope for others. Her personal growth was mirrored by her growing connections in the wider community. She made friends who understood her journey, mentors who guided her, and neighbors who welcomed her presence. Each new relationship was approached cautiously, with patience and observation, yet with an open heart. She had learned the value of careful trust. She balanced it with warmth and empathy. Despite all the progress, she sometimes revisited memories that were painful. Certain sounds, words, or actions would trigger a rush of fear or sadness. She learned to sit with these feelings, to acknowledge them, and then to let them pass. Meditation, reflection, and journaling became tools that helped her process trauma. She discovered that strength did not come from ignoring pain, but from confronting it gently and learning from it. One day, she was invited to speak at a larger gathering. The room was filled with people who wanted to hear her story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as an example of courage, resilience, and careful action. She spoke calmly, explaining how attention, patience, and courage had guided her decisions. She emphasized the power of observation, the importance of allies, and the value of speaking when the moment was right. Listeners were moved not by dramatic descriptions, but by the quiet authority of her words. After the event, she received messages of gratitude and requests for guidance. People were inspired by her example and sought advice on how to help vulnerable individuals in their own communities. She realized that her experience had grown beyond personal survival. It had become a tool for change. Her journey, once painful and frightening, was now a beacon for others who needed hope and direction. She also began exploring creative ways to share her story. Writing short accounts, creating art that reflected her feelings, participating in community programs allowed her to process her past while educating and inspiring others. Each project reminded her that she could transform experiences of fear and oppression into something meaningful and positive. Through all of this, she remained humble and grounded. She knew that her courage had been nurtured through observation, careful decisions, and quiet action. It had not been easy, and it had not been immediate. But the lessons of patience, awareness, and subtle influence had carried her further than she had imagined. She understood that true strength often manifested not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent, deliberate choices. Evenings became moments of reflection and gratitude. She would sit in quiet spaces thinking about the journey she had endured, the people who had supported her, and the life she was now building. She recognized that while fear had once dominated her days, courage had now taken its place. Courage that was patient, deliberate, and quietly powerful. As months turned into years, she continued to grow. Her education expanded, her influence widened, and her sense of purpose deepened. She carried her past not as a weight, but as a guide. Every decision she made, every interaction she engaged in, was influenced by the lessons she had learned from hardship, fear, and the careful cultivation of courage. She understood that her journey was ongoing. Challenges would arise, obstacles would test her, and fear might appear unexpectedly. But she now possessed the tools to navigate them: observation, patience, careful action, and the quiet confidence that comes from having faced the darkest moments and survived. Her life, once overshadowed by danger, had become a testament to the power of inner strength and deliberate courage. She walked through her community with a sense of purpose. Each small interaction, each gesture of help, Each conversation carried weight because it was informed by experience and empathy. People respected her, not because she demanded it, but because her calm authority, quiet courage, and thoughtful actions commanded attention naturally in her heart. She knew that being marked for sale had been a moment of extreme injustice. Yet that moment had also revealed her resilience. It had shown her the depth of her courage and the value of careful, deliberate action. And through her continued efforts to help others, to speak, and to educate, she turned that past into a source of hope, strength, and transformation for everyone around her.